Oh, hello. I'm Ross Miron, and tonight I will be discussing the protection of intellectual property. So what exactly is intellectual property? Intellectual property takes no physical form but has value and is an asset. That is to say, it is an expression of information that is not necessarily a physical product. It can take the form of anything from patents, designs, copyrights, trademarks, licenses, or any other form of informational resource. The legal test for determining ownership is whether or not ownership can be documented and if value can be assigned. If an article of intellectual property were to be stolen, the value can be calculated and the value can be used to determine the damage to the owner of the intellectual property. It is only because of the fact that intellectual property has value that allows for the rights of the owner to be enforced within the legal system. Now, intellectual property that lacks clear documentation regarding ownership cannot be effectively protected. A value of the property is required to prove that the owner has suffered in some way as a result of their IP rights being transgressed, or the courts cannot necessarily prove a theft. Also, without clear documentation regarding ownership, the courts cannot determine that the intellectual property owner had any property to even be stolen. Forms of intellectual property are protected similarly to tangible assets. Intellectual property can be stolen and counterfeited, just like any product you'd find at a store. With intellectual property, however, the ownership and value must be communicated to consumers, or the law for the rights protecting intellectual property will not take effect. There is also some gray area regarding intellectual property usage by non-owners that allows things like academic usage of certain forms of intellectual property to be legal. The responsibility to assign intellectual property is ongoing for copyright holders, having to ensure that ownership is placed upon all intellectual property items that are placed into cyberspace. Formally indicating the value of the product will also ensure that the intellectual property owner does not lose capital with transmission of the intellectual property. This is especially important for intellectual property available on the World Wide Web. It is somewhat recently that intellectual property rights can be enforced over national boundaries. The Internet is a global service, and therefore the intangible nature of intellectual property allows it to be easily transmitted to different parts of the world. Initially, there were great difficulties in prosecuting intellectual property rights violators due to national boundaries. But with the advent of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, it has given hope to enforcing intellectual property rights worldwide. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act of 1998 puts into effect international regulations. That is to say, it puts into effect the World Intellectual Property Organization's Copyright, Performances, and Phonograms treaties signed in Geneva in 1996. The treaties criminalized copyright infringement across national borders. It also increased the penalties for such acts. Unfortunately, North America and Western Europe are the only places where these provisions are properly enforced. Software suffers especially from piracy across national borders. Now please, if you will, join me in my next session where I will examine software piracy in greater detail.